You're listening to Harrowsmith Radio. I'm your host, Wayne MacPhail. In this episode, we spend a little time under a virtual umbrella with Harrowsmith's go-to weatherman, Mark Sirois. Mark has been doing long-range forecasting for Harrowsmith Almanac and extreme weather prediction for Southern Quebec for years. Now, a modern home weather station has empowered him to think big and broad. Next up, Alberta farmer Leona Staples on how entrepreneurship and innovation has kept her family farm alive and adapting for generations. So, weather and weathering the changing years, all in this episode. By the way, if you want to read Harrowsmith Magazine instead of listen to it, you can subscribe to the print version online at harrowsmithmag.com. And you can find Harrowsmith Magazine on selected newsstands across Canada. But for now, settle in for the next half hour of Harrowsmith Radio. By day, Mark Sirois is a Quebec-based senior manager for IBM Canada, but his 5 to 9 side hustle is predicting extreme weather for Southern Quebec, and he does long-range forecasting for all of Canada for the Harrowsmith Almanac. The self-taught meteorologist started prognosticating when he was a teenager with just a weather radio and an atlas. But as he explains in this interview, the advent of a high-tech, no-moving parts weather station has completely changed the game for him, and he's ready to up it. How so? Listen in. Here's our conversation. Hey, Mark, thanks so much for joining us. I'm really interested in this conversation because I'm really interested, as I think a lot of people are, in weather forecasting, and especially these days in terms of extreme weather. But first, I wanted to get a sense of how you got into this. You work at IBM by day, so how did you get into weather forecasting? Is it something you did as a kid, or where did that come from?
It goes back a number of years. Even as a younger child, there's always an interest in snowstorms and thunderstorms, but I think I was around the age of 14 or 15 when I started really getting interested. I received a weather radio as a gift from my mother when I was 14. And I enjoyed the fact that I was getting weather warnings through there for thunderstorms every 15 minutes or so. And I started plotting storms on a map in one of my atlases or something, and I would just plot where it was 15 minutes ago and then where it is now and the direction it's heading. This is way before internet and the data that we have today. I enjoyed the idea of being able to predict where it was going to go next and how long it would take for it to go. And that kind of started there, and it didn't evolve much from that point until the internet started. And then I started being able to have access to radar and stuff like that. And then I started to get interested in learning about forecasting, and not, forecasting for tomorrow, but down the road. I like the idea of being able to be the first person to know about something coming before I hear it from mainstream media. So yeah, it was around the age of in my teens that I got into it, and I self-taught myself over the decades in terms of understanding the mathematics and the models around forecasting long range.
When did you start sharing that stuff?
Other than, talking to my family or to a couple of friends saying, I think we're going to be having a storm in about 4 or 5 days that we should be paying attention to. I really started sharing it through the advent of Facebook. And it was a form of therapy, actually, that created the Facebook page that I have. Back in 2007, I had burnt out at work. I had already been around 10 years working at IBM, and it was a difficult period. And I said, I need to step away, and I did. And in that form of therapy, I said, let me find something that I'm passionate about in the meantime while I'm recovering, and use this new medium, Facebook, to see if I can do something with my friends. So I created this, it started as a group, first of all, and I started to just kind of cut and paste stuff that I was seeing from some of the models that I was following, because I started subscribing to models through AccuWeather that allowed me to get access to all of the different models and tools that meteorologists would use. And I started to build forecasts there, and it started, 10, 15 people following, and then word of mouth started to spread, and then, 100, 200 and 300, and you went, wow, actually people are following me that I don't know. And then over a period of, I guess 15 years, closing in on 30,000 folks, primarily out of Southern Quebec, that follow the doings that I create around weather forecasts and so on, for basically the southern part of Quebec, a little bit of northern Vermont and New York, and as well as eastern Ontario.
Well, I want to come back in a little bit and talk about how you might be spreading that out a bit. But I'm really interested right now is when you talk about predicting weather, especially long-term weather, extreme weather. I know there's things like volcanic activity, solar activity, El Nino, that kind of stuff. Are those the sort of broad, big picture things that you're looking at, or what all goes into your forecasting, especially longer term?
I wish there was just one formula that could be followed, that you could just apply it to everything and just pull out a forecast. But a lot of long range forecasting is basically looking at history. They say that history has a tendency of repeating itself, and it does. Yet the history that we had 50, 100, 200 years ago is a different environment than we have now due to climate change and pollution and so on and so forth. So you have to look at analog forecasts. So analog forecasting is basically saying, okay, what is our situation today, and what do we know in the next month or two or next 3 months, right? We know, for example, we can say whether we're going to go into an El Nino or a La Nina pretty well for the next 6-month period. So we can know, like, for example, right now we are in a La Nina, and we will be going into a neutral pattern probably by the end of spring, summertime.
Can you explain that a bit before you jump in? So folks that don't understand that, what does that mean exactly?
La Nina is basically when the waters in the Pacific near California are cooler than normal, the surface temperatures of the waters. And El Nino is when those same waters are warmer than normal. And then when you get into a neutral period is when you're in between. It's neither. And that particular pattern from El Nino has global ramifications. If it creates a pattern off of the Pacific coast, it will basically create patterns that affect Europe, that affect northern parts of North America. There's global ramifications there. So that's kind of an indication as to what can we expect in next winter, right? So if we say to ourselves, it's going to be a neutral, so neither an El Nino or a La Nina, then you can have a little bit of everything during a winter. You could basically have storms, and then you could have periods of mild weather, periods of cold weather. You get a mix of everything. When you have an El Nino, then you kind of have a milder pattern, a milder flow that flows through the country. La Nina is inverse. Mind you, we had a La Nina winter last winter, and for a big part of the country, we had milder temperatures than normal, which I think surprised a lot of folks, even myself, in terms of forecasting for the winter. I mean, the winter kind of went according to plan, with the exception of that it ended quicker than it should have in a lot of places. And we had, right now we've been experiencing much milder than normal temperatures here in Quebec over the last few weeks. So you say to yourself, okay, so if it didn't respond to La Nina the way it should, then what were the other factors, right? So like you mentioned, we look at what is pumping out in terms of volcanic activity, sunspots, the solar activity, the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. You have to look at all these things as well and try to understand, so what was there that made things not respond the way they should? And so yeah, you have to look at all these things and then pinpoint a year in the past that looks the closest to that, and you pinpoint these particular analog years. So you say, okay, 1977, 1983, 1956 looks similar in terms of what we were experiencing then as to now. So based on that, what can we expect to happen next? And then,
now, those analogous periods in the past, given what's happening with extreme weather or climate change and stuff, are they, when you map them to the future, are you simply sort of amplifying those factors because of climate change, or what do you bring to the equation because of the differentiation in the environment because of climate change?
You've got to kind of factor in that it's going to be warmer than it was. When we talk about climate change, which is very political, some folks will say, well, it's not climate change, it's weather cycles. We've been warm, we've been cold. We've gone through ice ages, we've been through very warm periods, and we're just part of a cycle, and eventually it's going to be getting colder. Yeah, there are weather cycles. And in fact, we should be getting colder. We should be in I think it was 10,000 years ago that we got to the warmest part of the cycle. And now we are over the next few thousands of years getting cooler and cooler. But we should be cooler than we are now, which means that, yes, there is cyclical weather patterns that affect the climate, but what explains the reason why we're not as cool as we should be? And so you have to then point to climate change and what man is doing to the planet to account for that gap between where we should be and where we are. So you have to kind of factor in when you're doing these forecasts and looking at analog years in the last 100 years, that there's going to be more warmth involved than there was. And if there's more warmth involved, then what are we expecting, or what should we expect? And don't forget, we write these forecasts in almanacs and we put these things out that are, sometimes saying, well, in the second week of February, there'll be a snowstorm on the fourth day of the week. And, this is not forecasting to say this is written in stone. The forecasting, especially when it's long range, is talking about the probability of a particular scenario as opposed to another scenario. So if you look at putting all this stuff together and you look at solar cycle, you look at your volcanic activity, all of this is creating an environment that also is going to impact what we're going to be feeling 6 to 12 months down the road. So all of that's got to get factored in. You look at what that is going to mean in terms of probabilities of the kind of weather to expect, and then you do a sign of the cross and you hope that you're on the right side of the track. Then but any meteorologist, as long as they've been in the business, and the longer they've been in the business, they will know that long range forecasting is one of the most difficult things to do, because it's hard enough to pinpoint 7 days down the road. To do 3 months, 6 months, 12 months down the road is almost insane. But you try to look at probabilities, and what we do when we do these Harrowsmith Almanac forecasts is try to prepare people for, am I going to need a lot of firewood this year, or may I need less? Should I spend more in making sure that my roof is going to be, the shingles changed before we get into the rainy period, because it's going to be really bad, or it's not going to be so bad? You try to help folks plan themselves in terms of bigger items rather than, should I plan my wedding on the 14th of June 2022? Harrowsmith is saying it's going to be sunny, so let's do it.
And so it's sort of longer term, broader news you can use, right?
Yes.
So you mentioned other meteorologists. So you said you were self-trained. So what do meteorologists who trained as meteorologists, went to Meteorologist U or whatever they do to do that, what do they think of what you're doing?
It's a good question. It's a valid question. I do have a connection somehow with one of the folks that works at Environment Canada here in Montreal. They're aware of what I do, whether they like it or respect it or don't. I think anyone that comes in and says, here are vitamins to take and stuff to do to avoid getting cancer, and they're not a doctor, and the doctor sees that and they're saying, well, I'll leave it into the hands of a doctor.
Sort of the Gwyneth Paltrow of
weather
forecasting.
I'm the goop of weather forecasting here. But I know that they do look at what I put out there. A funny thing is that when Environment Canada has to forecast a storm, there's a protocol that they follow. My freedom is that I don't have a protocol to follow. I see it and I put it out there. And I always try to put an asterisk on it saying, this is what I see. Is it going to happen? I'm giving it a 50-60% chance it's going to happen, but I want you to be aware that something could be happening here, so that if you have a doctor's appointment or something next week, that you just put it in the back of your head and saying, I gotta watch this. Environment Canada will put out a statement maybe a few days ahead of an event, and then they'll put out a watch maybe within 24 hours. And then they'll put out a warning the day before, or even the day of a particular storm. In that respect, I'm sure it frustrates them that they have to wait before they can put it out officially, whereas I'm putting out a warning, 5 days in advance because I feel good about it. It's nice to have that freedom, but you also have your critics. When you have 100 people on a page and then you have, close to 30,000, the amount of feedback that you get is quite large, to the point that I don't look at it as much as 97 or 98% of it might be very supportive or welcoming the fact that they're getting this information ahead of time. There are always those that will say, you're exaggerating, you're a fearmonger, you're this and that, whatever it is. And sometimes it can be pretty vicious, and sometimes I do see it.
But who's got time for that if you're trying to do something good, right?
Exactly. And once again, I'm one guy. I don't have a team. That's
so I want to talk about you mentioned you've got 30,000 people on the Facebook page, and I've looked at it, and you're right. A vast majority is congratulating you and thanking you for the work you're doing. And one of the interesting things about it, and it's a technological shift that's happening and that you've helped exacerbate, is this move towards, I think you promote the Tempest weather station, and there's other small weather stations that people can put in their backyards or in their fields. And that's bringing you, and I think in the U.S. certainly, the models that are being used for forecasting, a whole bunch of new data that's going to allow for more hyper-local forecasting. But I think also in your case, it's opened the door for you to think about not only dealing with extreme weather in southern Quebec, but also across Canada, right?
Right. So before I get into the rest of Canada, just a word on that particular weather station, which, the one that we're mentioning is the Tempest weather station made by Weatherflow. The reason why I'm so gung-ho about it is no one ever approached me. No one ever said, oh, we hear that you have a weather page and we'd be, if you could talk about us. I have been seeing these ads for the last few months. I've had a number of different weather stations, expensive kinds and not so expensive kinds. I've enjoyed testing them. Problem with the ones that I've tested, and which is the majority of weather stations out there, is that they have some sort of a mechanism that moves. So either you have the little wind cup anemometer that spins. Eventually that thing gets hit by something and one of the cups falls off and there goes your anemometer. The rain gauges get blocked sometimes. Sometimes there's a mechanism failure in there. And it was just proving to be aggravating that whether you spent a lot of money or not so much money, that you'd have to end up replacing these things. So when I saw this particular one that didn't have any moving parts and the things that it said it did in terms of measuring rain through haptic sensors and so on, I said, well, let me give this thing a try. And also I wanted to have an app on it that made it easy to get information, so I wouldn't have to go out and look at anything or have to go into something that was not so user-friendly. And I just got really attracted to what they had and the way it was set up and where the data was going. It does go to the National Weather Service. It also goes to Weatherflow themselves to help them in the forecasting that you receive on your app for your particular area. And so I like the artificial intelligence behind it and where they were going with it. So I put my recommendation behind it just based on what I thought was decent and working for me. Now, what it allows you to do, which is kind of leading to the Canadian part, is that when you have the weather station and on the app, it allows you to see all of the other, provided that the person that has the weather station doesn't click on the don't share thing in the app, but most people do. It allows you to see all the data from all the other stations across the country, in the States, in Europe. Surprising how many folks around the world have one of these tempests. And so because of that, it made me think I've been focused on Southern Quebec for so long. And with the work I've been doing with Harrowsmith over the last few years, it only makes sense to expand and get a little more Canadian friendly and engage more with the rest of Canada and see if what I do is beneficial, if folks are going to enjoy being able to see systems explained, weather systems explained ahead of time, and the probability of them happening or not happening, and just going down that road. And so at some point in 2022, I look to officialize and start the Canadian severe weather network that would cover the entire country.
And those weather stations would plug into that. That's the thing I think is so cool, is that you've built a community. There's now a technology that would allow that community across Canada to help you with your forecasting, and hopefully down the road, Environment Canada with their forecasting.
Exactly.
Well, thanks very much for talking to us, Mark. It's really been, I think, an interesting journey for you to come to this point and now think about moving out into across Canada, which is really exciting because you have been doing that with Harrowsmith for almost 10 years now, I guess, right? So it's really exciting to see that relationship with Harrowsmith and your relationship with Weather blossom into something that hopefully will aid Canadians from coast to coast. So thank you very much.
Not a problem, Wayne. I really appreciate the time that we spent today. Thanks for reaching out, and we'll talk soon.
That was Mark Sirois predicting scattered weather stations across most of Canada. Leona Staples' great-grandfather, Jacob Daniel Quantz, was a homesteader in late 1800 Alberta. Staple and her forebears have kept that farm alive, but in a form that Quantz would hardly recognize. A combination of Staples' love for home economics education and entrepreneurship has allowed her to reimagine the Quantz farm into a jungle farm that's become a family and school trip destination. I talked to her about how she managed that transformation. Here's our conversation. Leona, thanks very much for joining us. I wanted to talk about your family farm because it's been in your family for generations. I think you're the great-granddaughter of Mr. Quantz, who started the farm. And it's changed dramatically since his days. You've turned it into something, I think it's really interesting. It's a very educational farm, a very hands-on farm for folks. Can you talk about how you shifted from what your great-grandfather imagined for the farm and what you've made it become?
I never knew my great-grandfather, but I only know stories from my dad. And, he was a very progressive man. He was a veterinarian in a time that was, trained at the University of Guelph at a time when that would be an unusual thing, that a settler would be coming out to a homestead in Alberta and have training as a veterinarian, that he wasn't just one who self-taught, but rather actually had the training. So I envision Jacob Daniel as someone who was very progressive, loved reading, and would have done whatever he needed to do to continue the farm to be successful.
You've taken a very different approach to the farm. You've taken a very entrepreneurial approach and a very educational approach to the farm. Tell me a little bit about what you're doing on the farm in terms of the sort of entrepreneurial aspect of it.
So I would hope that every farmer mindset is entrepreneurial, because you do need to run your own business. But what do we do that's a little different? I think we have the direct connection to the customer. So then when they're asking us things, it allows me to mull it over in my mind and see how I might be able to utilize that idea to make something that other people want. So for example, last year in the summer, we had lots of people starting to say to us, we're going to grow a garden. We're going to stay home. And could you plant things for me? So we created garden boxes where we had a whole set of little starter plants that people could purchase and take and put into their gardens. So for those people who maybe didn't have quite as much knowledge on growing things, it gave them a chance to have something that was already started, a type of plant that would grow here in central Alberta. And it also came with me, because they could ask me all sorts of questions, whether it was on social media, whether it was through email, or whether they watched one of my YouTube videos to learn how to prune a tomato or pick something.
So you've done other stuff. You've had pie making sessions there. You've got a vegetable box program. You've got a preschool program. You've got a jam making program. You keep coming up with really interesting and innovative ways to keep the farm going, right?
Yeah, we do. And some of that comes back to the point you made about education. And it is a real passion of mine. And so I do like to take some ideas and see how we can make it something that can be educational and still keep kind of connected to the farm.
You got a home economics background, right?
I do. I have a Bachelor of Science in Home Economics, and that's what I did before I came back to before I came back to the farm. So I worked as a district home economist with Alberta Agriculture, so an extension agent, teaching adults, rural women mostly.
If somebody was a farmer, maybe has a small farm, maybe has a larger farm, but has been primarily focused on the activity of farming, as apart from the other stuff that you're doing and other people like you are doing, what would be your key piece of advice for somebody who says, I really need to diversify, I really need to think out of the box more about the farm? What would your advice be?
Well, that's a really good question. I think you have to love people, and there is some individuals who love agriculture because it is quite solitary, and they love they're very passionate about the soil and about tilling and about, planting and watching it grow, but they're doing it on their own or with just a few people. So if you're looking to do something like our farm, you have to love people, because you have to know that they're going to be everywhere all the time. That's an important piece that you have to ask yourself, is that something I'm willing to do, is share my farm with other people? Then I think it's a matter of just going out and asking your schools, are you interested in a location for a field trip that I could help you with? Or, asking a mom's group, is there something that I could work with you on that create something like our ABC program, a preschool program? So I think then it's just a matter of getting out into the community and seeing what needs are out there.
Well, thank you for sharing that advice, and thanks for taking the time with us today.
Okay, have a great day.
That was Leona Staples, deep in the jungle farm of Alberta. So, here we are at the end of this episode of Harrowsmith Radio. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please consider subscribing to this podcast at Apple Podcasts or in your favorite podcast player. And please tell your friends and family. Got feedback? We'd love to hear it. You can email us at letters@harrowsmithmag.com. That URL, harrowsmithmag.com, is also where you can order subscriptions online. And you can find Harrowsmith Magazine on newsstands of selected stores across Canada. Until next time, for Harrowsmith Radio, I'm Wayne McPhail. And also, until next time, remember these 4 words: make, grow, sustain, share. Tune in for the next episode of Harrowsmith Radio.